Okay, well, hello everybody, and welcome to another presentation of the online ColdFusion Meetup. I'm Charlie Earhart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And in this edition of the Meetup, our 262nd, being recorded on Thursday, July 9th, 2020 at noon U.S. Eastern Time, we've got Dan Wilson, who's going to be talking on your best options to build modern front ends with JavaScript. And looking forward to that presentation. But before we do, I just want to also point out, since we've announced it in advance, I want to say it now here on the recording as well, that next week, we've already got scheduled another session, and that'll be with TJ Van Tol on what web developers can learn from native mobile developers. So you can go to the ColdFusionMeetup.com site and read more about that session. And as always, you can get recordings of this and past sessions via recordings.coldfusionmeetup.com. Okay, and with that, Dan, I'll go ahead and stop sharing, and you can. There you go.
Survey
Looks good.
says.
Take it away.
Yeah, we're winners. So before I begin, I'd like to just mention that Charlie Earhart has been a tireless supporter of the ColdFusion community since I got into ColdFusion in 1999. Charlie, if you don't know, is who you call when your servers aren't working right or things are down and you don't know why. He's able to get in there and with a very short amount of time bring you some relief. So if you run into trouble and don't know who to call and you shine the Batman symbol in the sky and Batman doesn't show up,
Thank you
call
for
Charlie.
that, Dan.
In this hour, we're going to talk about your best options to build modern front ends with JavaScript. So for the last 4-ish years, I've been in the JavaScript space, but more of in the strategic arena, like more the business end of JavaScript, how it works in companies and efficiencies and costs and things like that. And I wanted to do this presentation for a while because I think for those that haven't dipped their toe in the water, who haven't chosen a JavaScript tribe to belong to, the space is exploded, and there's so many different frameworks and so many articles out there that are, outdated the second they're published. And as we've been talking, there's been 4 new frameworks that have come around. So the goal of this presentation is to kind of provide a high-level overview of what your choices are, according to me, and then what you can do about it. So right now, I work with Digital Primates. You may remember Digital Primates from the Adobe Flex and Air arena. They spoke a lot at different conferences for Flex and Air. And now the company is really involved in Enterprise JavaScript and React. We do a lot of application modernization, business consulting, and we also curate the Enterprise React newsletter. So if you're interested in receiving great enterprise level React content twice per month, sign up. We'll never spam you. Trust me, I know. I make the newsletter. So I figured we'd start this out with a math test. Go ahead and perform this math calculation in your head. How long did that take you? I'm going to guess not that long. So the book up here, Thinking Fast and Slow, is a phenomenal book. In fact, it won the Nobel Prize in Economics when it was released. My wife and I are really big fans of behavioral economics. We read just about everything that there is on the topic because it's fascinating about why people make choices and things of that nature. And this book goes into all kinds of scenarios, like why fighter pilots make mistakes and why people choose the wrong food and so on. The lessons of the book can be boiled down into really 2 concepts. You have appropriately named System 1 thinking and then System 2 thinking. Now, Daniel Kahneman is a phenomenal behavior economist. He is not a marketer. If it was me, I would have chose way better words, but let's go with what he did. So when you performed 3 times 4 and hopefully got to 12, that was an example of System 1 thinking. And System 1 thinking is ingrained behavior. It's your brain basically works by channeling electrical impulses. And if you do something enough, you form this semi-rigid gateway so that impulse is very, very efficient. And that's why when I say 3 times 4, you immediately think of 12. And System 1 thinking is easy to do. In fact, you do this all the time. Have you ever driven somewhere and forgot the whole route? Like you don't even remember driving there, but you know you did it and you were conscious and everything was fine. That's System 1 thinking. Let's look at System 2 thinking. How long did that take you? Now, when you did this, the feeling of working through 31 times 42 was a little more stressful. There's a bit of friction. Some of you probably said, I'm not going to waste my time with that. And I want you to remember that feeling, because when you're super good at something and your thinking is optimized and you can flow in system 1 thinking, it isn't really that hard for you. But when you move into system 2 thinking, it requires energy, it requires thinking, and as human beings, we're designed to be efficient with our energy and not to waste energy. And so system 2 thinking can be uncomfortable at times. And I think that's a great way to kind of segue into our great chosen profession of technology. So technology does tend to meander back and forth like this river. Sometimes it's calm. Sometimes you can see around the bend. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes it just doesn't go right. We can attest to this being heavily invested in Flex 10 years ago and then having the rug pulled out from under us. It's what you do after that, I think, that matters. The other lesson here is you just can't make the perfect choice that'll be the right choice for 40 years. It just doesn't work like that. So if you take a look at this slide, lots of words, but I basically categorized the major architectural trends over the last 20 years. Like when I first got involved in technology, everything was thick client. That was like the great thing to do, installable apps. And around that time, the web was really coming into its own, and everything was web-based, because then you got to ship the latest version of the app to everybody and not worry about installing. The downside was there wasn't a whole lot you could do with the user interface. And right around this time is when I met our friend JavaScript. And I thought it was horrible. Like I had to write JavaScript 3 different ways for 3 different browsers. There wasn't a whole lot you could do. The coolest thing I ever did was wrote like a comet tracer that would trace the cursor as you moved it with words. It's kind of it. Later on, the expectations of the market led people to put more and more functionality on the front end side. That's when Flex got very popular. That's around when jQuery came around and we could all decorate our web pages with fun interactive things. Silverlight, if you're down with Silverlight. Flex and Silverlight did not stand the test of time, because in the world of interfaces, closed runtimes really just didn't make it. Open runtimes were the rule of the day, and now we're writing thick client apps with the web again. This time we're doing it with free runtimes, theoretically in a cross-platform way, and you shouldn't have to do too much changes with your JavaScript across the different browser versions. Now, over time, users have gotten more and more sophisticated. Some of this is Amazon's fault and some of this is Apple's fault, mostly because thanks to those two, I expect everything works perfectly all the time. I expect that whatever application I use is optimized for my goals, that I can use it on whatever device I want, and that it looks pretty. I also expect that I can tap a button and stuff shows up at my door tomorrow. Now, that's not been the case with this whole pandemic thing, Amazon. So if you're listening, Amazon, I'm not getting the full benefit of my Prime membership, Amazon, but, it's a pandemic. What are you going to do? These user expectations carry forward as these users use internal apps, or even if you have external customers. So it depends on if you're selling internally or externally. But if you have apps that are designed for employees to use, and those employees find those apps don't meet their expectations, that they're either cumbersome or hard to use, or don't let them accomplish the task the way that they want, often the employee won't use the application. They'll do work over email, they'll call their buddy on the phone, they'll fail to put in data, they'll just go around the system. And the goals of these systems is designed for collecting all the data or providing an optimized workflow or an automated workflow. And so when we frustrate our users, they're not helping us. Now, if you have customers, pure customers, what they do is vote with their feet. They go somewhere else. Why would I buy from you when I can go to Amazon and all pages are instant and stuff shows up quickly? Now, I don't think that's fair because, Amazon's got billions of dollars literally to spend on this application. And, the poor enterprise person has a couple developers and a couple of months to do something great. But life isn't fair and users are unrealistic sometimes. So, we have to embrace the fact that users are more sophisticated and they have higher expectations, and it's up to us to meet them. This is a well-known quote about JavaScript. This guy named Brendan Eich wrote the prototype for JavaScript in 10 days. I think this is impressive because if someone sat me down and said, write a language in 10 days, I'd be surfing the web for a new job. But he pulled it off and wrote a thing you can call a language, and it worked, sort of, kind of, and has grown up into the thing that we use today. So, if you've used JavaScript in the past and you found it to be wanting or weird or missing key features, you're right, but you might want to give it a second look. I put on the slide here the progress of ECMAScript. ECMA is a standards body, an international standards body, and they've taken up JavaScript and made these specifications where, there's a global standard that can be met for JavaScript, and you can see there's this period of time where there wasn't a whole lot going on. This prompted the rise of jQuery and so on to kind of smooth some of that out. But in the later years, you can see the standards body has been pretty busy adding stuff into JavaScript. So if it's been a while since you've tried JavaScript, you might find that it actually has some really cool capabilities, and these are things that you can just use without requiring external tools. So for this talk, I surveyed the landscape, looked to and fro, and I centered on, what I wanted to do is give you 3 solid choices to take a look at. Now, probably in the comments, there's someone now saying I missed one of their favorites, and I probably have. But the perspective I want to give you is if you want to choose a JavaScript flavor, let's say, to build the next 5 years of apps, from where I sit, these are the 3 you should be looking at. There's Angular, there's React, and there's Vue. So for comparison, I put down the metrics I pulled from GitHub. These are all open source. They're freely available. They're listed on GitHub. And they have very vibrant metrics. Now, you might look at a specific line or column here and try to compare it as better or worse than another one. There's really a lot behind these numbers, and so I wouldn't use them so much to claim one is better or worse than the other. But the point here is they're very, very vibrant. There's a lot going on. They're accepted. There are people behind this. There's people using them. They're moving forward. So they're also stable. These are choices that you can expect will be there, in 5 years. And when we're building applications, we can't simply think of today. We have to think of, what's going to work for the entire life cycle of the application. So let's go through a couple rules of engagement brought to you by the fine folks at Haterade. I only used the official Getting Started tutorial for this piece because I thought if that's the way they want you to interact with their JavaScript library or framework, then that's what I'm going to use. It's also the most up to date. So if you go through my research here and you say, well, he could have used this, I could have, but I wanted things to be kind of fair. I also wanted to type everything out by hand. So that way I got a feel of what it's like to really use this tool. And if you know my typing skills, they're not the best. Still, they're not the best. So, I had to force myself to stick to this piece. The third thing is all the code had to run on a local environment. Now, many of these frameworks have like an extra environment you can use that's like a no config environment that does a lot of nice things to get you up and running. I chose not to do that because this needed to be more about the JavaScript framework itself and not necessarily like a helper environment that could cloudy the waters somehow. Now, if you choose to do these evaluations, feel free to use their helper environments. But I thought it wasn't fair, so I didn't do it. And then lastly, everything here is in alphabetical order. So if I've got your pet framework not in the first place, The reason why is I sorted A to Z. So we're going to start off with Angular. You might remember Angular from AngularJS. That got really popular in the ColdFusion space. Around 2015 or 16, the Angular team kind of shifted focus into what we would call modern Angular, and AngularJS doesn't really resemble nor work with modern Angular. And so if you've evaluated the previous AngularJS, it's all different now. So to equate this in ColdFusion terms, it's kind of like ColdBox. Like, not exactly, but in the sense that if you can agree that, the things that ColdBox does are the way that you will do them, then everything you need comes out of Angular. And it's pretty good, like ColdBox. Now, it also has a one true way. So the benefits of this are it's well established how you do things like routing and injection and components, and there's even a style guide that everybody uses. And so if you really want a very standard approach, Angular has it. And in cases where maybe you have a bunch of different teams that are switching in and out all the time, and they're all working on different apps, it can be really nice to have one established pattern or one established routing way. That way you can kind of keep code quality and keep people trained up and move forward. The core team for Angular works for Google. I can't remember if they have 20 people or if it's more or less at this point, but there's also lots of people in the open source community that help contribute to the framework. And for me, it was important that we not only think about the web, but other platforms that are relevant as well. So in each one of these evaluations, I'll mention what's possible for web, mobile, and desktop. Obviously for web, it's the Angular framework and HTML. For mobile, you have NativeScript, which is a truly native way to write iOS and Android applications. You have Ionic, which is WebView based. Same with Cordova and PhoneGap. Then on the desktop platform, you have what's called Electron, which is a web-based way to package code and run it on a specific desktop. And then the developer experience, it's super duper vibrant and everything's good. So it has about everything that you need. If you scan this, this was my experience with getting started. What you build is a master detail app with create, read, update, and delete functionality. This one took me the longest at around 3 hours. You learn a lot, really. You really build a pretty sophisticated, comprehensive application. And there's a bunch of techniques you'll learn, and they're all very useful for moving forward with Angular. And you can even use this as a template for your own applications. Now, I did this one last of the group just because that's how it went. But I found this to be the most uncomfortable framework. There was lots of files, there was lots of odd syntax, there was all kind of extra things I needed, and I just felt really out of place. Like 3 hours was not enough time to get comfortable with Angular. And so if you go through this process and you end up feeling like I do, I think the reason why is because you really learn this full platform. The Angular thing is we're not a framework, we're a platform. And so you have to learn the whole platform, and I think 3 hours isn't enough time for that. So let's look at what you build. You build what's called the Tour of Heroes, which is a list that you can edit and change, and then there's a detail page, and then there's a way you can pass messages around, and it's a bit of a contrived example. I've never been asked by a client to build a tour of heroes, but I've been asked many times to build create, read, update, delete, and switch pages and add messages and pass data back and forth and build components, and those are all the things you're going to learn in the Tour of Heroes. Like I say, it dawned on me at the end of this that this really could be a template where you can use these patterns to build your own applications. Let's actually look at what some of the code looks like. So this is Angular code. I'm going to highlight some sections here and kind of point out what you're seeing. So the first line that turned green has that asterisk ng if, and this is kind of a handy way to decide whether or not to show this div. This is evaluated. If hero turns out to be a thing, then it shows this chunk of HTML. If it's not a thing, then it doesn't show it. The next green line, you can see curly brace, which is kind of a binding or evaluation syntax. You can think of it like your friend, the pound sign or the octothorpe in ColdFusion. And obviously I'm evaluating some object with a parameter of name on it. In this case, we're using something called a pipe, and the pipe has this uppercase piece, and this is like a shortcut front end thing to do formatting. There's other ones besides uppercase, like date formatting and so on. And I thought that was some nice, tidy syntax. This next line shows an evaluation of the ID of the hero. In this input here, you'll notice a square bracket and a parentheses and an ng model. Angular has a really cool reactive forms capability that lets you kind of tie in your form to some data, and it saves you a whole bunch of back and forth. That's how you do that. And then lastly, at the bottom, this parentheses click shows you how you can wire up to an event handler on that button. It's a lot less code this way. So, if you look through this, you can see there's all kind of really bizarre syntax that might be unfamiliar, but if you know what it does, it's actually pretty concise. And what it represents is a whole lot of capability that you get for very little typing work. Here's a little bit more code. At the top here, you see these import statements. You will import lots of stuff all the time. It's kind of bizarre how you do this, but the cool thing about it is each component, and this is code from a component, has just what it needs to be successful and no more. And I think it's really nice to see all the dependencies that this component has in an easy to view way. Also, this import syntax is used by things like Webpack that trim out unnecessary code to provide a more optimized file size on the other end. So, that's a benefit. Then you have this injectable syntax. So Angular has a dependency injection framework. So it'll inject things into your components and other places by the clever use of metadata. Down here, you can see export class hero service means that you can basically think of this as the component name. And then this last green line here, that $ brace is like an evaluation. It's almost like a runtime evaluation, kind of like if that was pound signs. If you notice, there's some backticks in here. And I noticed that too, like 20 minutes after I couldn't figure out why my code wasn't working, because in the font they used on the site, a single quote and a backtick looked close enough that I was befuddled for some time. Wasn't all that thrilled with it, but once again, I guess there's only so many characters to use and there's so much functionality, they had to use a lot of them. The last thing I'll point out here is in this last green line, pass handle error. With Angular, you're not necessarily directly using JavaScript, you're using TypeScript, which is a transpiler that you type one thing over here and it spits out JavaScript on the other side. And TypeScript adds lots of extra functionality on top of JavaScript, like types, and there's lots of shortcuts and things like that that you get for free, but you do have to learn TypeScript. So if you hate TypeScript or are opposed to non-JavaScript stuff, it may not be for you, but TypeScript is extremely popular. It's supported by Microsoft. It's a really good choice. And the people that take the time to learn it find it really helps them build cleaner code from the jump and avoid a whole bunch of errors that would leak into code and be found later at runtime. And remember, we don't really want to aggravate our users. The next topic is React. React is a very large framework as well in terms of popularity. And from a ColdFusion perspective, think of it like custom tags. So if you remember custom tags, they're basically encapsulated UI, and that's basically what it is. You can pass some things into custom tags and attributes. You can pass some things into React components via props. So there's some similarity there, and tags can be nested. React components can be nested. That's a pretty good parallel I haven't looked at the comments here, but someone's probably telling me I'm wrong, so you're right, whatever. But if Angular is to Coldbox, then React is the custom tags. Now, they don't call themselves a framework. They actually say we're a library, meaning that intentionally they're very, very focused just on the UI space. And there's a whole bunch of other things you need to build an app, like routers and HTTP modules. Those all come from the community. And you'll find there's often more than one accepted way. Now, to some people, that's exciting. And to some people, that's terrifying. And the answer is they're both right. The core team works for Facebook, and there's a pretty large ecosystem of contributions and extra things. In my mind, React has the very best support for platforms. It has obviously the web with the React framework and HTML. On mobile, you have React Native, which is kind of like their official way to write native mobile applications with React. You also have native script, which we talked about earlier. Then you have the Ionic, Cordova, PhoneGap kind of web view people. On the desktop, you have React Native UWP, and you also have coming React Native for Mac OS. Those are actually super cool. In fact, I just published an article like a month ago in our Enterprise React newsletter where the team at Microsoft that does the Xbox app basically swapped out Electron for React Native UWP and ended up saving like 60% of their file size, and it was like super way more performant, just because building a native app, which is what you're getting with React Native, is always going to be more performant than wrapping web pages in Electron. Let's take a look at the getting started experience. So you build a tic-tac-toe game. That is not a typo. It is a tic-tac-toe game. And when it said, hey, build a tic-tac-toe game, I thought, come on, really? But it actually makes sense. And let me get into why in a minute. The tutorial took me about 2 hours, and this is the one I did first. And I actually really thought this one was well done. It was well written. They never surprised me. They never threw in anything weird that threw me for a loop. You learn how to build components. You learn how to pass components. You pass data around the components. You learn how to manage state, like the values of things and how to handle changes to that state. And also you learn how to refactor components. And this was the sneaky benefit of this tutorial, because the way that I've always built applications is you build something and then it needs to do something else. You've got to refactor it. And it seems to be an endless refactor stream until you get where you want to go. Then you ship it, and then there's more refactoring to come later. The React folks kind of hit this head on up top, and you build something somewhat simple, and you progressively make it more complex, and they walk you through how to refactor it. And I thought it was great. I really thought it was great because any kind of application you build is going to need to manage state. It's going to have nested components. You're going to have to refactor these components. And basically everything I needed was in this getting started guide. Let me show you this tic-tac-toe game and be prepared of how awesome this looks. So it is in fact a tic-tac-toe game, and I won. Of course, I was playing me, so I would win anyway. But you can also kind of wind back the game because it uses this internal state processing thing that keeps kind of copies of what the state was. And that was super useful because you'd also use this in a real application. Like if you go back in the browser, you need to go back to a certain state. So don't be put off by the fact that it's a tic-tac-toe game. It's really a stateful series of components and a lesson in refactoring them. It looks like this. Lots of imports, yay. Same kind of benefit. You know your dependencies. You can trim the tree with Webpack. Function here, React is kind of more functional in nature. It asks for more of a functional programming paradigm. It's something to keep in mind. And it uses this thing called JSX. So if you're looking at this button class and you're naturally relating that to HTML like I did, you'd wonder why the class attribute is called class name. And the reason why is because while this looks like HTML, it is in fact JavaScript. And I'm going to have a slide about this capability. It's called JSX. We're going to look at why this is actually a good thing. Because in my mind, this is one of those things that triggered my system 2 thinking of, well, why am I having to remember weird attributes for things I've written the same way for 20 years? There is a reason. So I'll point out here, you've got this on-click handler, you've got this curly brace binding syntax, and you've got these props. Props is like the main attribute collection that you're passing around to your component. So that's what that is. Let's look at the JSX though. So JSX is you're actually writing JavaScript, but it's very concise. And so the thing on the left, that bag of text, is equivalent to the thing on the right. And in fact, if you were to build this set of HTML nodes on the left without React, you'd be doing, create element calls ad nauseum and adding attributes. So, there's a whole lot of JavaScript that you're not having to write by using JSX. And it's actually worth the agony of learning some of these extra names. Now let's look at Vue. So Vue probably jumped out of the bushes a couple years ago and has really grown very, very fast. The Vue philosophy is, I'm a framework. So finally something admits it's a framework. And I would equate this in the ColdFusion world to, let's call it framework 1. Like, it does a lot, but it doesn't do too much. It doesn't provide everything you need, but it provides a lot. So it's somewhat lightweight. It's organized by more of an open source team, which is in contrast to Angular, which is kind of controlled by Google, and React, which is controlled by Facebook. Vue is controlled by the Vue core team. Now they have, obviously you can use Vue on the web. You can use native script and also the Ionic and Cordova and PhoneGap crew, and Electron for the desktop. And it has a super vibrant community. They kind of emphasize we build beautiful apps as a differentiator early. There's not really anything in Vue that makes apps more beautiful because it's a JavaScript framework, but it was a point of focus for them. And they have a lot of converts from the AngularJS crew, because if you remember, when AngularJS was popular and lots of people built apps on it, then Angular 2 came out, which wasn't compatible. Lots of people were like, what do we do now? And some had to think, and some stayed with Angular, and some went other places, and some went to Vue. Because Vue kind of looks a lot like AngularJS. So the getting started experience takes you through 7 key skills with Vue. And it took me about an hour. This really was the shortest of all of them because it really was a graduated process of skills. And 6 of the skills are how to decorate HTML, which would sound very familiar to someone who used jQuery in the past. And then you also build a Vue component. Now, the upside of this is I felt like I could use Vue immediately in an application because it uses these sort of progressive enhancement things, and I can see cases where they would fit. The downside is I didn't really get a great feel for using the component model, as they say in Anger. How do I build nested components? How do I pass stuff around? There's probably a part 2 of this, but since it wasn't in the quote getting started experience, I chose not to do it just to be fair with my haterade rules. So if you're familiar with jQuery or AngularJS, this will be super simple for you. And the component model is based on a web standard for components model that's out there. And so you can kind of feel secure that at least they're aligning with web standards. And the whole thing is really pretty simple. Like I say, I breezed right through it. The examples were really clear. The downside is, like I say, I don't know if I would be able to write a component-based Vue application with what I learned, or even know what questions to ask at this point. Now, they had a side getting started experience with Scrimba. Once again, chose not to use it because it was a side deal, but if you want to look at Vue, it's probably worth it. Has some videos as well, but like I say, outside of the rules of engagement. And the last thing is, because you can sort of decorate HTML and not go full-on app, the tendency might be that you do that too much and create architectural issues later. So let's look at some Vue. This is what you build. So these are the basic skills that you see. if this was interactive, you would see at the top, there's a binding thing. The second piece, I'm basically binding into a dynamic title. So as soon as I hover over it, it would basically tell me what time it is, because that's important. Then you build lists, and the list thing repeats over data, and it's pretty interesting. Probably the least app-like of all of them, but if you go through the getting started, you'll really understand what you can do with Vue. From a code perspective, it's really straightforward because you're writing HTML and then decorating it. So if you look here, this is their binding syntax, that same kind of double curly brace piece, but there's nothing special on this page that tells you you're in a Vue application. Now, when I went through the getting started experience, there was a little bumpy for me at first because it said to put some code in there, and so I put this JavaScript code at the bottom, and it didn't actually work. And I spent quite a while trying to figure out why it didn't work. And then I may have cheated and went to that Scrimba thing and tried to see what the end code was, and then went back, but I wouldn't admit that because it's against the rules of engagement. But Vue's pretty straightforward and it's pretty simple. I think if you think to yourself, I'm really a jQuery person, then Vue is probably going to be your game. So with those experiences, which one do you think the winner is going to be? I don't know, because I think if I'm being fair with you, and I've spent the last, like I say, 4-ish years more of in the JavaScript strategy thing, there really is no winner. And if you try to get to what's the best of anything, you're just going to get shouted down by somebody who thinks their sports team is better than your sports team. And it's not really, you can't really make a deterministic equation here. So, there's elements of this that work for certain groups, and there's elements of these frameworks that work for other groups. And so I'm going to spend the next few slides kind of working you through the differences. And ideally, you feel more empowered to make a choice or a series of choices to explore later. So the first thing is, what's the philosophy of the framework? So I've stack ranked these from left to right. On the left, you have more freedom. You can pick and choose what capabilities you want. The framework itself isn't forcing you to do too much. And on the right, you have more out-of-the-box capability. So you have the one true way, the walled garden of experience, the everything chosen for you. Depending on your philosophy, one of these is more attractive to you than others. Vue kind of sits right in the middle. Commitment to a single vendor kind of works along the same lines. This is important because if you go back to my original slides and remember that whatever choices we make today are going to be the bad ones in 10 years, the more committed you are to a single vendor, the more stuff you're going to have to deal with if that vendor has a change of heart. And a technology landscape is littered with things that were cool once and now aren't able to be used. So I know today these are strong choices, and there'll be strong choices in the future, but at some point they won't be. And if you've put all your chips on a single vendor, you're going to have to rebuild entire apps. And if you've put your chips on little pieces of your app on a single vendor, those are the pieces you've got to fix. And depending on how you view the future, this is going to be a good thing or something to keep in mind. App quality across platforms, I give the edge to React because the React Native seems to be working on all the major platforms. And so that gives you a native-like experience with faster frames per second and a more at-home experience on whatever platform you're on. And then Angular and Vue are sort of tied. Angular has been around longer, so I think it has better support with things like NativeScript and Ionic. But at this point, they're similar enough that there's not a bad choice there. In the first hour experience, I give the edge definitely to React. And then because Angular was so complicated by necessity, I really think if you want to look at Angular, budget a longer period of time and spend time with each of these elements, because it's not you're getting all this stuff out of the box, so you've got to learn it and get comfortable with it. And then the ability to enforce consistency across the whole app, I would go Angular is a better job there, because once again, you have the kind of one true way to lean on. And if you have, many hands over many years, you're going to end up with a more consistent app if there's obviously less room for interpretation. Now, yearly, there's this survey called the State of JavaScript. And so I thought, rather than me telling you what I think, and you shouldn't listen to what I think because why would you? Let's listen to what 20,000 people had to say. And this chart shows you data points over the last 4 years around satisfaction and usage of lots of JavaScript frameworks. And so the way you'd read this is the more left it is, the less people like it. The more right it is, the more people like it. And the higher up it is, the more people have used it. And the lower it is, the less people have used it. So you can kind of see these little snail trails. And I think this is helpful for seeing the trend since 2016 of each of these frameworks. Now there's a lot here, so I've kind of called out the ones we've been looking at in this slide. You see the yellow pieces, you can kind of walk backwards through their snail trail, let's call it. React is basically stable. More people are using it. They're about the same satisfied with it. Vue, more people are using it. More people are happy with it, and it's kind of staying around the same now in the last year. And for some reason, more people are using Angular, but they're liking it less. Now, why is this? I have no idea. I really don't know. Let's look at another chart. Here's kind of the same information, but plotted differently. There's satisfaction and user count. This is a more granular. And so the folks at State of JS have this blocked into quadrants for assess, adopt, avoid, and analyze. And these are where the frameworks, ranked, basically. And the State of JS survey is public. If this kind of thing interests you, they have a lot of great information that I didn't put in here that you might find worth a look. And by the way, take this when it comes out next year. It helps a lot of people. Like I say, about 22,000 people took it. And it's a nice cross-section of the community. And then here's the 3 frameworks in terms of their awareness on top. Angular, Vue, and React are at 100%. Everyone who took the survey knew about them. Then the satisfaction is below. 89% for React, 87% for Vue, and 38% for Angular. Once again, I don't know why this is. I have a feeling some of it is just because the model for Angular changed so drastically that some people who used it just didn't like the new one for whatever reason. Angular is not a bad choice. It's not. Many people build great apps with it. I wouldn't use these numbers solely to make your decision, but they should be a factor. And then lastly, if you're really talking about avoiding risk in the future, you can look at languages that compile to JavaScript. So that way you're not, stuck to any specific thing. If that's your bag of tricks, the same awareness and satisfaction rankings are here for the dominant ones. TypeScript is absolutely the first choice. The rest are clearly, close seconds. And what you get for that really is, as JavaScript changes, if you write to TypeScript, they'll handle converting it to new JavaScript for you. Basically the value there. So that's kind of the summary of your modern choices for building front ends in JavaScript. You may remember me. I'm Dan Wilson. There's my Twitter handle. I work with Digital Primates once again, and we do a lot of Enterprise React stuff. In spite of that, I hope I was fair and balanced here. And let's spend the next 15, 20 minutes on your questions. If I don't know the answer, somebody in here does. Charlie, can we switch to
Yep.
Yep.
Well, and you should have been able to see the comments popping up as well, but now you'll be able to see them more easily. And while we're waiting for him, yeah, no problem. There were several, and you can just look up starting at about 11:22.
Charlie is the man. All right, we like that. And yeah, Tim and Math, I like that. Dan Skaggs says howdy. Adrian survived the Flexidus. Ouch. Jeffrey Hauser, what framework were you talking about?
I think it was Angular. And by the way, there's timestamps there that might help you. You can kind of tell by looking at the timestamps when you were talking about something.
Yeah, so you know, I hope I said that enough, because I really don't want this to seem like a hatchet job. But you know, Angular, there's a lot to it, and actually, I took an Angular course a while ago with a guy named Maximilian Schwarzmuller. His name is a handful to pronounce, but his Angular courses are phenomenal. And he's got one on Udemy that's comprehensive and not expensive at all. I think hundreds of thousands of people have taken this course. If Angular is something you want to learn, that course is a really nice walkthrough of everything. And it does take a while, but it's worth the investment if you think Angular could be for you. You know, my friend Dan Skaggs here is in the audience, and he is an Angular aficionado, and his use case is that they do have lots of teams working on the same code base, and they like the fact that, you know, there's an accepted way to do things, and for them it works really, really well. So, you know, please don't shy away from any of these. ng model is actually not part of the reactive forms, it's part of the template form APIs. I'll defer to your expertise, sir. $ brace is part of EX6 template strings. Is that the little tick sign too? Because I never saw that in any of the other frameworks.
Hey, while we wait for him to perhaps answer your question, okay, and he just said that. Let me also say, for the sake of everybody else, the 33 folks that are still here, if you look on the right side of the screen, there's a set of evaluations. If you could take a moment to please fill those out while Dan's addressing questions, we'd appreciate that.
With Angular, your HTML ends up being so far from actual HTML with non-standard attributes. The only framework I think that really looked like HTML was Vue. And so if that's important to you, then you might give that a look. I think, you know, if you're going to use some of these modern capabilities, then you've got to revert into something different. You know, the JSX thing, originally it was weird to me, but when I understood what it was really doing, I can kind of understand why it's worth learning. You know, the reason why I put that whole system 1 and system 2 thinking thing up front was because, you know, a lot of our gut feelings around what we're doing, you shouldn't rely on those. You've got to go through the war here and use this capability and see, is this the kind of thing I can really use? The first 5 minutes, you know, your brain's going to tell you, stop doing this. This is pain, agony. I don't like this. Like, those are just reasons to stop spending energy. And if you're going to make one of these bets on a framework for the next 2 to 5 years, you know, you got to push past that. I just don't know if Angular, Dog Food, Angular, or Google Dog Food's Angular. Yeah, they build lots of internal things with Skaggs answered that, but yeah, they do use a lot internally.
Yeah.
Thanks, Carl. Talk about what framework works best with mobile apps. So Jeff McLean, are you still here? Yes, you are. Okay. So in a previous life, my previous job, one of the things I worked on was native script. And so if there's an area I know really well, it's mobile development with web technologies. And the core problem is the native mobile experience is an optimized experience for that platform. It's the fastest, it's the most optimized, it has the best components that look at home on the device. And the farther you get away from that native experience using native code, you're accepting trade-offs. Now, something like NativeScript, for example, that lets you connect to the native components on the device directly without any boilerplate code or bridging code. And so you can get a pretty near native experience with NativeScript. You can also do that with React Native. And unless you're building 3D games or something like that, those two choices are going to be fine. If you're building 3D games, you don't need to be using any kind of abstractions. You need to be as close to the metal as possible. Now, beyond the native mobile, which we've said, firstly, there's native, then there's web native, like the React Native and the NativeScript. Then you get into what's called WebView-based mobile development. And this is where they basically take HTML and package it up in a WebView, which is a native component. And it looks and smells like a mobile app, but it isn't. It's HTML. Now you can make them look like native apps, but they're still not. And there's disadvantages with processing time and rendering time and file size and so on. So, in my perspective, and this was the conclusion I came to, React Native offers the most native experiences across the most platforms. You have web, you have iOS, you have Android, you have Mac OS, and you have Windows. No other framework does that. Now, maybe you don't care about desktop. In that case, Angular and Vue both work with native script, and so does React, so that would be a choice. Or React works with React Native, and so that would also be a choice. And so it depends on what you're trying to support overall. But if you want to check the most boxes, React with React Native is everywhere you want it to be. Jeffrey Hauser has a book series on Angular, so that would be pretty sweet, including things that interact with backends in ColdFusion. Well, that would be very helpful for folks. What other questions do you find folks have? Hey, Jeffrey, thanks for interacting, man. I appreciate it. It's always
And
good seeing
Jeffrey, if
you.
you'd like to give a talk, you want to go into more depth somewhere, feel free. Let me know.
I'll try to wrangle him after this and see if we can get him booked for something.
And while we wait for the comments coming in from other folks, I'll just say that to everybody, if any of you have a topic you'd like to present, we welcome having you on.
Well, thanks, Tim. And I've always got time for you, buddy. Text me if you want to chat. Yeah, Node.js is boy, that thing ate the world, didn't it? So that's server-side JavaScript, and I've used it a little bit, so I'm probably not the best person to talk about what all it can do, but um, you know, yeah, I mean, exactly. So it's to think of it like the back end to the front end, and you can stay with JavaScript all the way through. Brett, you're very kind for your words, sir. I'll make sure to send you a check after this. Well, look, if you guys want more content like this, we're doing what we can to stack the meetup with weekly meetings. And for record, if you have any interest in a topic and want to present it, let me know or let Charlie know. And if you have any interest in a topic and you don't want to present it, still let us know because we can find someone who will want to do it. Now, if you want to reach out to me directly, feel free to do so. I'll put my email address in here. Hopefully, I'm not going to sign me up for a bunch of weird spam. And ask me whatever you want. I'll give you what I think, or I'll help introduce you to someone that probably thinks better about it than me. And if I don't know the answer, I can point you to someone who does. Like, this is a fun thing for me, so feel free to reach out if it's useful.
And while we wait for more chats to come in there, let me take a moment while we're on the recording to say also, Dan just gave a hint, and I meant to say this back at the beginning. I apologize I didn't. That Dan's been helping me out in recent weeks. He's lined up the next 2 weeks of speakers, and we're working on more. And he's, batting ideas around with me and just generally being very helpful. So I want to thank you, Dan, for your help with getting the meetup going again. It was great timing because some of you know we just started back in like late May, getting a couple going, and then around that time, and jumped in and said, "Hey, I can get more people too." So we've got other things planned. So we will say he's helped me out. Definitely, thank you very much, Dan. There you go. Yeah.
Hey, we got a newsletter sign up. Yeehaw.
And I might have missed that. I might have been typing something, but that's a newsletter you curate, right?
Yeah, I mean, I assemble it. The team at Digital Primates is actually the ones finding all the cool articles. So it's really, a by developers for developers thing. But I, assemble it all
Excellent.
and
Yeah, check that out.
send it out.
Well,
They do all the hard work.
all
I do the
relative.
easy stuff.
All right, cool. It looks like the questions have petered out. There might be somebody who wants to ask a question and doesn't want it to be on the recording. So let me go ahead and stop the recording. There you go. Go enjoy yourself, Brett. And we'll say thank you again, Dan. And we'll have TJ next week. And we'll be announcing another talk beyond that. And we've got other ones lined up beyond that. So got the band back together. See you all at the next event. I'll wait for a couple of chats that are coming in. Thank you all.
You never know when that
Or
key
another really
question
good
comes
comment
in.
towards you, because well deserved, and you deserve to hear that.
Can't ever have enough of those. Yeah. Well, great. Well, this is good, Charlie. I appreciate your help. Getting this up and running today, and
Thank you,
it's
sir.
a tireless active service that you do.
And thanks again very much for you to come on and give the
appreciates it.
presentation. All right, sir, I'll go ahead and stop the recording and then just hang out for a second, see if anybody's got one after the recording.